This is Aphorism 14. Nietzsche here is going to introduce a new dichotomy and deconstruct the metaphysical aspect of these two positions. The two positions are going to be materialism on the one hand and then idealism on the other. And specifically, this chapter is going to focus on a critique of materialism. Not in the sense that Nietzsche is going to argue that they're wrong, the materialists or the physicists, but that they are like basically everyone else, raising their claims to a metaphysical level that is too high, according to Nietzsche. So he's going to want to bring this level down. He's going to contextualize, according to him, what physicists are doing when they're doing physics. So the quote says, "Now it is beginning to dawn on maybe 5 or 6 minds that physics too is only an interpretation and arrangement of the world, according to ourselves, if I may say so, and not an explanation of the world." Right? So when you break down the world into its physical properties, when you're looking at, say, the movement of objects according to forces and to various measurements regarding the material nature of the things you're studying, whatever you can say about your findings isn't going to be an explanation of the world as such. It's going to be an interpretation of certain events that are happening according to certain mechanisms of thought and reason and also will. So, Nietzsche is saying here that we have no right to raise a physicist or materialist orientation to the world to the level of metaphysics, of absolution. Okay, and why not? Well, because it's just very easy to look at things from a totally different perspective. And we're going to get into that now. The idealist is going to have the opposite, but let's read the quote here. And it's going to start here. "But to the extent that physics rests on belief in the senses, affirmation of the senses as legitimate, as worthy of trust, it passes for more than just an interpretation, and will continue to pass for more, namely for an explanation for a long time to come. It has our eyes and our fingers as its allies. It has visual evidence and tangibility as its allies. This helped it to enchant, persuade, convince an age with a basically plebeian taste. Indeed, it instinctively follows the canon of truth of the eternally popular sensualism. What is plain, what explains only what can be seen and felt. This is as far as any problem has to be pursued." So what this basically says is, when we're studying the world, what can we deal with? Only that which can be seen and touched. Only that which coheres to the demands of the materialist methodology. If something touched, then it's ignored. What about concepts, feelings, ideas? Well, these are only going to be explained eventually, according to the materialist, once we can, observe the direct movement of the particles in our mind or whatever. Once we have a material explanation, and only then do we understand what's going on with the non-material aspects, or supposedly non-material aspects of our subjectivity, of our consciousness, etc. But what Nietzsche's going to say is, you can interpret your subjectivity materially, or you can interpret it ideologically, or you can interpret it a whole set of other ways. It's going to be an interpretation. Okay, so he refers to materialism as plebeian here. I don't think it's meant to be insulting. It's meant to say that people who are drawn to materialism are a certain type of people. And he's going to say at the end here that they're fitting for people who are hard workers, laborers, industrialists. They're all very attracted to materialism. So, with every critique and every dichotomy Nietzsche has, there's going to be the other side. And I'm going to go to that now. So, Nietzsche says, conversely, and he's conversely to the materialist view of things, the strong attraction of the Platonic way of thinking, or idealist way of thinking, I think, is going to be tied in here as well, consisted in its opposition to precisely this empiricism, which is to say, Plato's going to say the senses are constantly wrong. They're constantly being deceived about the world. Whatever the senses perceive is constantly moving, changing, in flux. If we want to be logical, if we want to understand the world, we have to use that which is most accurate, our mind. Our senses are not accurate. Our mind is accurate. Descartes' going to say this. Plato said this. It's a very common claim across all idealistic philosophies, is to say that the senses, they're tools, but they aren't going to tell us what the world is like. They need to be sort of filtered by the purity of reason. So this is the opposite to the materialists. The materialists want to trust the senses, and the idealists want to completely doubt the senses. So Nietzsche's referring to those who are willing to doubt the senses as having more discriminating senses. As let's just go read. It was a noble way of thinking, suitable perhaps for people who enjoyed even stronger and more discriminating senses than our contemporaries in our materialist age, but who knew how to find a higher triumph in staying master over these senses. Right? So in idealist philosophy, even though the idealists will claim that through thought they are accessing the true metaphysical nature of the world, Nietzsche's revaluing it here and saying, okay, well, there's something interesting about idealism, which is to say that through the mind, people are sort of triumphing over nature, right? There's sort of an ascension implied in idealism, which is the mind is actively, joyfully making the world its own, right? As filtered through it, the mind. So anyway, keep going. And they did this by throwing drab, cold, gray nets of concepts over the brightly colored whirlwind of the senses. Man, it's so interesting how Nietzsche's being both critical and praising at the same time here. Like, he relates to idealists in the sense that there's a joy in this, and there's a triumph in thinking and interpreting the world according to your mind. However, the way that they do this so often is using cold, dry, drab, gray nets of concepts that really don't capture the beauty and the movement of the world. Why? Because usually idealists are too obsessed with certainty, of being completely precise. So they're going to sacrifice so much in pursuit of that. So the rabble of the senses, as Plato said, right? The rabble. This is a devaluation of a type of way of thinking, but it's also connected to a sort of hierarchy of people, of values, right? So the plebeians are the ones who are going to want to build things. Physicists love the practicality of their science because their science allows them to build rockets, ships, airplanes that move and interact in the world. That's very satisfying to them. Plato's not concerned with this, not directly. He's concerned with insight, the psychological aspect of philosophy, although he wouldn't call it psychological. Nietzsche's going to call it psychological. According to Plato, is the mind. The mind is the access to the universal. But for Nietzsche, he's going to say, well, yes, it's according to the mind, all right, but the mind isn't connected to any universality. It's just another way of interpreting the world. Okay. So, I'm going to erase this. Okay. There was a type of enjoyment in overpowering and interpreting the world in the manner of Plato. Right? Enjoyment is such a key word here for Nietzsche. Remember, the gay science. How do we enjoy what we're doing? So he wants us to take something from Plato here. Because Plato and thinkers like him, the idealists, are able to enjoy their work in a specific way because of how active their own minds are in absorbing and interpreting the world. It becomes their own world as opposed to simply a world out there that you are coldly studying. Okay. Here on the quote here, where man has nothing more to see and grasp, he has nothing more to do. This imperative is certainly different from the Platonic one, which is basically the opposite of this, but for a sturdy, industrious race of machinists and bridge builders of the future, people with tough work to do, it just might be the right imperative for the job. So materialism is exceptionally practical for a type of plebeian race of individuals. Materialists, Marxists who love labor and molding the world, building the world, constructing the world. It's just a given that this is what they want to do, and therefore their metaphysics is going to be an extension of this, which is to say it's going to be grounded in the senses. On the other hand, according to Plato, Plato isn't someone who's going to be building things. He's not someone who's going to be engineering an airplane, right? He's someone who's, in a classroom. His primary mode of science is thought, reason, logic. All of these things are internal to the mind, and according to Plato, they do not rely on the senses. They're independent of the senses. So, two completely different ways of viewing the world. Is one right? Is one wrong? Nietzsche's not going to say that. He's demetaphysicalizing. He's taking the metaphysical claims out of these ways of viewing the world. He's portraying them as sort of tastes. If you have a plebeian taste, you don't want to trust the sciences, you might be drawn to idealism. If you love the material world, studying animals, studying mechanisms of forces and power, then power used in the physicist sense, then you're going to be a materialist. So anyway, that is 14. Again, the deconstruction and revaluation of a dichotomy. Even though he doesn't say the word materialism or idealism here, this is what he's talking about. Deconstructing this dichotomy, making it less metaphysical. Anyway, thank you very much. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and we'll move on to section 15 in the next video.